So the first thing that I want to point out is that when we talk about impacts of migration, what is oftentimes popularly stressed is the simply one impact, which is the economic impact. But indeed, impacts of migration are far more diverse than that. They comprise of political, cultural, as well as economic impacts. Moreover, these impacts straddle sending and receiving contexts as well. So oftentimes when we think about the impact of migration, particularly when we're thinking about it in light of today, which is the culmination of a lot of discourse, anti-immigrant discourse perhaps, we're oftentimes thinking about it in relation to the receiving society. But we also have to think about the context of the sending society, and of course, the other impact that we have to think are on the migrants themselves, right? The migrant bodies and on the group. And so I'm really looking forward to discussing that, and I will moderate your questions after each panelist speaks for about seven minutes or so. And so with us today, joining us over Skype, we have Malika Bahovanova, who has a PhD in sociocultural anthropology from Indiana University. Her research interests include the anthropology of state and bureaucracy, migration, political anthropology, poverty, and Central Asia. Her research focused on migration management and policies regulating labor migration through an analysis of their bureaucratic production by actors such as the International Organization of Migration. She conducted field research in the IOM's offices in Tajikistan to study the application of IOM and other international actors' agendas in the field of labor migration. Malika holds a degree in international relations from the Russian Tajik Slavonic University and an MA in peace studies and conflict resolution from the University of Notre Dame. Sorry. Also with us we have Georgina Ramsey, who is a visiting scholar here at Indiana University, as well as a sessional academic with the Center of Excellence for Equity in Higher Education at the University of Newcastle, Australia. Georgina's specializations include refugees and forced migration, displacement and humanitarianism, gender and motherhood, sovereignty and citizenship, racism and institutions, and equity and diversity in higher education. Her fieldwork has been conducted in Uganda and Australia with refugees from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, Rwanda, and Liberia. And we also have Elisa Vani, who is the Executive Director of the Burmese American Community Institute, which is located in Indianapolis. The Burmese American Community Institute is a nonprofit organization founded in 2011 that provides educational and vocational support to the Burmese community in greater Indianapolis. The Burmese American Community Institute strives to support community members regionally, nationally, and globally through strategic partnerships and advocacy. So of course the bulk of their work has to do with the impacts of migration. And so with that, please begin. Should, Malika, should you go first? You want to go first? Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I can go first. Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dr. Ashutosh. And good morning, everyone. I hope everyone hears me well. Let me know if I need to adjust my voice. So maybe since we have very little time, I'll just start with my presentation. And the title today of my talk is Talking Development Encouraging Migration. And in my presentation, I will look at the relationship between migration and development using the case study of Tajik migration, Tajik labor migration to the Russian Federation, which occurs within the visa-free regime. So this relative freedom of movement, which also accompanied by the uneven developments between the former Soviet republics, created a market for the migrant workers in the former USSR. Tajikistan today is known as the country which is one of the most dependent on migrations, and it's usually explained by the having of its GDP being comprised of migrant workers' remittances. For instance, in 2014, prior to the economic crisis in the Russian Federation, remittances constituted more than 40% of the country's GDP. And the scope, of course, also could be seen through the numbers of migrant workers traveling in Russia. For example, out of the 8 million total population in Tajikistan, 1 million is considered to be at any time in long or short-term migration to Russia. And naturally, the influx of remittances to Tajikistan has allowed for articulation of the number of migration and development discourses that usually serve as an organizing principle for various agencies working in Tajikistan on migration management. And when I refer to agencies, I'm talking about international agencies, also local agencies, local non-governmental agencies, and state institutions. So I will just elucidate some of the main discourses that were happening during my fieldwork in 2013 and 14 in Tajikistan, and then we'll just briefly discuss the problems with the ideas of migration and development and the overall framework, why it's used. So the first discourse of migration and development that I wanted to touch upon is the most prevalent. It's mostly promoted by international agencies working in Tajikistan, and in particular by the International Organization for Migration. So the IOM vision, which IOM packages for its local partners in Tajikistan of migration and development, revolves around the premise of organized and ordered migration. And the second aspect of it is the entrepreneurial nature of migrant workers and diaspora representatives. So the first premise for migration and development to work is organized migration, and the formula which is used primarily to promote in Tajikistan is based on the example of the Philippines and the Philippines engagement, state institutions and private agencies engagement in Philippines in export of workers to migration. It is assumed that only organized recruitment can resolve the problems of migration and in the long term lead to sustainable development through increased earnings and ordered migration, as opposed to the chaotic movement of workers. And the second aspect of this discourse requires, of course, promoting entrepreneurial qualities among migrant workers who are supposed to use their remittances, use their earnings back in Tajikistan and invest in small businesses and into the Tajik economy, basically. And usually these ideas are translated into myriads of various bureaucratic initiatives and long-term or short-term projects which are implemented by international agencies in cooperation with Tajik state institutions. And the second discourse of migration and development has a very humanitarian framing to it. And this is the discourse which is mostly promoted by the Russian government, both in Russia and Tajikistan. For instance, Ramadanovsky, the former head of the Russian Federal Migration Service, the agency which is engaged in regulating migration in the Russian Federation, was using the word humanitarian, humanitarность, when he was referring to the visa-free travel of workers from Central Asia, which Tajikistan is another, to the Russian Federation. And here in Tajikistan also, during various meetings that I had with Russian embassy officials or FMS officials, former FMS officials, they were referring to humanitarianism when talking about migration and development, and when asked and probed of what does it mean development, they would refer to the availability of banks, mobile companies, service industries here in Dushanbe, the capital of Tajikistan, or the construction of high-tall buildings here in Dushanbe. So basically within this discourse, it is the largesse of the government, of the Russian government, to allow the visa-free travel to Tajikistani citizens for the privilege of wage labor in Russia. And in a way, this discourse also is reminiscent of the discourse of backwardness, which was quite prevalent during the Soviet Union, the backwardness of Central Asia, and the role of Russia in promoting and advancing its brotherly republics, and that also reproduces some of the old hierarchies, geopolitical hierarchies within the region. The third discourse, which is also interesting and which is quite nascent, is mostly articulated for the Russian audience. The first two are discussed within the framework of the sending country and for the sending government, whereas the third discourse is mostly for the Russian audience. And here, migration and development means something else. And it became possible with the recent legal changes into the Russian immigration law that went into effect since 2014, most of the changes were in 2013. So according to these changes, the old system of quota, state-provided quota for private companies to hire foreign workers was replaced by the system of work permits for migrant workers. And work permit, which is called patent in Russian, is a sort of private license which migrant workers buy and then maintain for up to 2 years in order to work in Russia. And for instance, if a worker wants to work in Moscow, he or she would need to pay about $300 to $400 to register for the patent, to pass Russian history and law test first, then go through a number of medical examinations, and then receive his or her patent. Consequently, a migrant worker will need to pay 4,000 rubles, it's around $70 a month, in fees to maintain his patent. And I should also add that none of these payments go to any social support programs for migrant workers or pension schemes. So as a result of these revenues, which mostly go to budgets, city budgets and regional budgets in Russia, FMS officials can articulate the development for the Russian audience on the basis of the income that city and regional budgets receive from patent payments. For instance, in 2015, Ramadanovsky, the head of FMS, quickly announced that income from patent and from work permit payments exceeded those from all revenues for the regional budget. The same story was repeated in 2016. So this discourse is used to articulate the and explain the use of migrant labor during the economic crisis in Russia that hit Russia after the sanctions and also drop in all revenues. So the problems with these discourses are myriad, of course. To name just few, the idea of organized migration, which is promoted by IOM, is built around the case of Philippines, a country which has visa regimes with the receiving countries where Filipino migrant workers go to work. And it doesn't take into account the nature and context of Central Asian migration to Russia. And of course, visa-free regime leads to workers' procurement of their jobs and jobs in the Russian Federation using the relatives and friends networks rather than approaching private employment agencies or state institutions. So here, state institutions don't really have a reach of a state such as Philippines to basically be more involved in organizing labor migration to the Russian Federation. And the second aspect of entrepreneurial nature of remittances is also problematic because most of the time, in most cases, remittances are consumed and migrant workers earn money for life cycle events and not for small businesses. So the assumption that migrant workers must be entrepreneurs and small business entrepreneurs is also a little bit that doesn't take, I would say, into consideration the circumstances under which Tajik workers go and work in Russia. And there are numerous reports recently coming out where international organizations and state institutions are fairly disappointed by migrant workers for not investing enough and developing the country. And of course, not to mention that the investment climate in Tajikistan is not the one which is privileging small business development. And what is more problematic with the humanitarian discourse, which is promoted by the Russian government, is of course that it, while it sells Russia well, it completely devoids migrant workers of agency and their hard labor and earned wages in Russia. It also overlooks the contextual circumstances under which workers work in Russia in order to earn their wages. And rather than reference to the post-Soviet context, what brings all of these discourses together is the economic benefit. As Professor Ashutosh already mentioned, the economic aspect of migration is highly prioritized, and unfortunately in a discussion when it comes to migration and development. And so migration development is about increasing GDP, it is about availability of service industries in the capital of Tajikistan, or it is about direct contribution of migrant workers to city or regional budgets. This development is basically seen through the laissez-faire capitalism, with no clear vision of actually what constitutes migration and development. And on a number of occasions when I was probing IOM bureaucrats or other bureaucrats who are talking about migration and development, as what is the case study or what is the vision, what do you envision in the long run, how migration would lead to development? The answer were like, basically, all this paradigm is fairly new, so we're just developing it, and there is no really clear example of clear vision of what migration development would look like for a particular country. So the articulation of migration development paradigms revolve around primarily the economic benefit of migration, and in particular with the regard of the influx of the remitted hard currency. Yet the academic literature on migration and development challenges the direct causality between the economic benefit and development, referring to the problem of dollarization of economy, de-skilling of labor force, or maintenance of corrupt sending governments and their resilience to reform. And we can see these developments also in Tajikistan. Currently, with the economic crisis in Russia, the Tajik government for already second year did not come up with a clear alternative to migration and to export of workers abroad, while basically taking a role of like sitting and waiting it out. Basically, once the sanctions will be over, then our workers will be able again to go back. So at the moment, the relationship between Tajikistan and Russia could be described more of the dependency rather than development. And perhaps the fact that the discourses that I outlined quickly today are based not necessarily overlap with the reality may give a reason to doubt that labor migration is a natural long-term sustainable path to development.
Thank you. Georgina?
I'm also going to talk briefly about economics and migration as well, which is not something I normally do. So my work is mostly looking at refugee resettlement, but today I'm going to take us briefly into a refugee camp and into context of asylum as well. But before I do that, I just want to I should actually mention, so I'm a visiting scholar here. I'm one of the lucky migrants to this country who doesn't really have a problematic time coming through customs and border protection when I get here, which has a lot to do with me being able to pass as an American. So I just think that's a political thing that's important to recognize. And I'm actually here writing a book on refugees, forced migration, and temporality, which was interesting that you brought that up before. and looking at how time and duration are implicated in the formation of sovereignty. So that's kind of my general thing at the moment, and also my new projects are looking at political economy. But just before we get into that, I just want to draw your attention, hopefully you can see it, to this door here. So this is from the Napa Valley Refugee Camp in Uganda, and this door is made from beaten out oil tins that were provided to refugees as part of their humanitarian aid package, which they actually don't get a lot of in this refugee camp, and I'll talk about that in a second. But this isn't just sort of a sustainable way of creating a door out of materials that are on hand. When I talk to refugees about it, because these kind of practical structures are all over the camp, things that are getting used and reused, and I asked them, what does this mean to you? And they said, well, this is our future. This is where we will be. So they were looking at this as a kind of a future trajectory, if you will, of getting to the USA, because these are people who view that as their only future option. They don't see going home as something that is a possibility for them. Uganda has an interesting relationship to refugees, which I will talk about. So these are the kind of people who would be considered to be in indefinite uncertainty. I was about to use my computer then to do that, but that would have been interesting. All right, so this is my fieldwork based on, I'm an anthropologist, so I try to get into people's lived experiences and their stories. Did most of my fieldwork with refugees in Australia, but also did work mostly with urban refugees in Kampala. So, my research in that sense, looking at, there's actually very few researchers who do multi-sided work with migrants, which is a little ridiculous given that migrants are people who move. So that's how I sort of set up my research questions. I wanted to know, I wanted to sort of question the assumption that resettlement is necessarily a durable solution to refugees. But I was like, well, how can I actually look at that if I don't understand what it's like to be in asylum? So that's why I ended up doing both. So this is not my image, but just to sort of throw back to what we were talking about earlier, most of the people I worked with were women with children. And that's because, for the most part, their husbands had been killed in the war or they were missing. Interestingly, the refugees who resettled to Australia are not generally widows, they're nuclear families. And if anyone has any sort of relationship with Africa and kinship models, I can tell you that the nuclear family is not something that is common. So Australia is very strategic with the people it resettles. It resettles people who fit a model of what it means to be an Australian. So it's called settlement potential. So this whole idea of resettlement and of refugee selection being something that, there's this line of vulnerable people that we just select, depending on who's the most insecure, is false. It's based on what the country perceives to be useful to them. So, supposedly we've got 65 million people who are currently displaced. Displaced does not mean refugees, but basically there's a lot of people who do not have a place that they call home that they're living in. So that's more people than were displaced out of World War II. So the UN and international governments are sort of scrambling for ways to deal with what is being called a problem, what is being called a crisis. And it's especially significant given that the UN estimates that the average amount of time that a refugee spends in asylum is 17 years. So these are not people who are necessarily going to be in these places of asylum temporarily. They're probably going to be there for, that may be changing with the newer waves that we have, but for people like the women that I worked with, they were in Uganda for much longer than a few months or even a few years. They were there for up to a decade and oftentimes more. So the question is, how do we make asylum a space that is sustainable? What sort of options do we have? What are the durable solutions here? So this is Uganda, for people who aren't aware, and this is the DRC, where most of the people I'm coming from are coming from the east of the DRC here. I also work with people from Rwanda and Burundi as well. I did most of my fieldwork in Kampala here, but also in some of the camps down near Barara, in the sort of the south of the country. So Uganda has what the UNHCR considers to be one of the most, in their words, refugee-friendly asylum policies in the world. It's considered to be progressive. So under the UN 1951 Convention 67 Protocol, refugees have a right to freedom of movement. Most nations of asylum don't allow refugees to do that, though, particularly in Africa. So they have what's called a containment model. So they will, instead of allowing refugees to live wherever they want, they say if you are going to be recognised as a refugee, you have to live in this specific place. So Kenya, the neighbour to Uganda, has one of the most famous containment models of refugee protection in the world. Uganda has, in the recent years, done the opposite. Primarily because even when they were trying to contain refugees in camps, refugees were living in Kampala. So about half of the refugee population have sort of always moved into the city areas, even if they didn't have the official refugee protection, because they did not see living in the camps as a viable option. So Uganda sort of saw what was already happening and decided to slap a policy label on that, which the UN has now said this is fantastic. Because it is a policy that they call a self-reliance strategy. So, and this is something that other nations are moving towards with asylum. They're seeing this as a sustainable way to manage refugees. Sustainable in the sense that and I'll get into what it means, but it is supposed to ease the burden, and they use that. So the UN and the legal framework around refugees is as burdens. Okay, so resettlement, for example, is actually not about protecting vulnerable refugees necessarily. It's often done through burden sharing agreements. So sometimes the people who are resettled are not those who are in the most danger, but they are the ones who the international system has decided need to be resettled as this burden sharing arrangement. But I digress. So in Uganda, the self-reliance strategy is that refugees are not supposed to be reliant on humanitarian aid. So that's supposed to be a good thing for everyone. It's a good thing for the government, it's a good thing for refugees who have agency, so they love those words of agency and empowerment. And there's two different ways in which they do this. So refugees are mostly funneled into, this is just an image from Napa. So just to give you a sense of what I mean by this is not a temporary situation, this is a fairly typical housing situation where they're building their houses out of mud huts. These are not people who are living in tents or anything like that. They're building for permanence. What these refugees aspire to, apart from resettlement, because resettlement is sort of a fixation for so many people in these situations, they aspire to a roof. All right, so the vast majority of houses were just tarpaulins with stuff on top of them, but if you were there for 10 years, you might be able to afford a roof. So this was something that was significant. So here we have a crop, okay? So this is a crop of, I'm not actually quite sure what that is, I can see cassava here. So Uganda has decided that refugees have this right to freedom of movement. They can live wherever they want. They also have legal rights to work. So giving refugees legal rights to work is one of the most significant policy things you can do. But in exchange for these rights, they have said, we will give you 2 years of humanitarian aid, and we will slow it. Okay, so you start off with quite a significant amount of aid, and then it sort of slows down. And after 2 years, you have to be self-reliant. So they tell refugees primarily to be settled in what is called a refugee settlement, which is not a camp. There is a very distinct difference in the UN framing of that. So in a refugee settlement, you're allowed to move in and out. You can talk to people in local towns around you, but it's not a space where you sit there in lines every month waiting for your rations. Okay, that's only available to the new people ostensibly. So the Ugandan government will give you a small plot of land, and they will say, this is your livelihood. You have 2 years to make this your livelihood. So refugees are kind of forced into a subsistence agriculture lifestyle. So that can work for some, particularly people with farming backgrounds, but I want you to imagine for a second that you were a school principal in Goma and you don't farm, and the government says, okay, here you go, you've got 2 years to sell cassava and make a living out of it. It's problematic, okay? Besides that, it also doesn't take into account what refugees themselves want. All right, so that's a really important part of this. So living in the settlement doesn't suit everyone, but the government, even though it technically has freedom of movement, refugees can't actually just go wherever they want. They have to seek permission to live in the city. And if they do that, the government says, okay, you can live in Kampala, but you can't get any aid, regardless of whether you're 2 visas. So if you just rock up to Kampala and seek refugee status, they're like, yeah, we can give you your status, but we're not going to give you anything else. Survive. So most people get funneled into this situation. The others that have decided to survive in Kampala, which is most of the people I work with, I asked them, I said, why are you here? Are you able to live here? Is this you a business owner? Like, what's giving you this capacity? And they're like, no, if I go to the camp, I'll be killed. They use the word camp, by the way. So their issue with living in the camp was not only about physical survival, but it was also about the idea that they were insecure. They were going to be targeted by political groups if they lived in a camp. So they come to Kampala, a lot of people without resources, and then suddenly they are expected to survive. So what this means is we have an environment where refugees are engaging in survival sex to live. They are doing the washing for Ugandan people. So this is a really common sort of way to get by. Basically picking up odd jobs. Sometimes the Ugandan people will actually hire them, but they speak different languages, they have a different ethnicity. There's a lot of discrimination against these refugees. So I worked with people who were kind of getting by in the informal labour economy, but they were getting beaten up by their Ugandan workmates because they were getting exploited and earning less money. But there was a recent report out from the Oxford Centre for Forced Migration on Uganda as the model for refugee economies. And it came out with this astounding statistic. Less than 1% of refugees in Uganda are unemployed. Less than 1%. And I was like, and this is from academics, colleagues, who I do respect, but I mean, having lived and worked, I lived in this compound. I'm also, not a lot of researchers live with refugees. They kind of do interviews during the day, then they go home at night. So I was actually living just across from this family here. And being unemployed is one thing. I mean, if you're sort of, what most of the women I was working with were working on the side of the road selling necklaces. So the Ugandan model is held up because it allows refugees to become entrepreneurs. But not everyone is going to be an entrepreneur. And I can tell you, if I was transported into Uganda without language, without anything, I'm not going to be the kind of person who's going to survive from my business skills. Okay? So this is part of the issue, but I'm sort of, Uganda is the model for asylum, and that's what I'm saying here. But the overarching problem with it is that refugees are not actually allowed to be legally integrated into Uganda. So they are not allowed to become citizens. They're not allowed to access the same right as Ugandan citizens can. So regardless of how good the asylum policy is, they're always going to be feeling and thinking like, shit, if another government comes in, am I out of here? Like, what step are we away from doing what Kenya's doing or being deported? So there's always this legal sense of uncertainty that goes along with being a refugee without having being in that place of being stateless, okay? Of being displaced. So that underlying issue is never resolved. So the sustainability question is important here. And just to sort of end, I won't go into resettlement because I could talk about that for 4 days, which would bore everyone. But just in terms of resettlement as an option, this was one of the situations I ended up with a woman called Camille. And she's living here in a tent with no electricity. And she was homeless, and she was homeless for quite some time. And I went and visited her in this tent, and she said to me, Georgina, I was living in a camp in Kenya, in a tent, with no electricity. I'm back here in Australia, except the difference was that the Australians had removed all of her children from her care as a child welfare intervention. So she had actually actively said, I would like to go back to Africa, and I have heard many people in Australia say that. So this whole idea about what we imagine to be a sustainable solution to resettlement really, or to displacement, really needs to take into account what refugees themselves think and experience through these processes. Thank you.
Thank you. This is an honor to be joining this distinguished group of scholars. Let me also introduce myself a little bit. I think I would rather introduce as ordinary citizen, perhaps a community organizer in Indianapolis with the Burmese community that's it. So I think today we have previous the panelists to discuss about causes, and also my colleagues here at the table discuss about impact. Probably my talk will be a little bit more focused on Burma, more of a case study. And then I will go through a little bit of the causes to provide some insight. Some of them may be overlapping, whether what we have see as causes and factors that is causing for them to be living. And then we'll go to what's happening with this community in the United States and what might be durable, long-term solutions and sustainable development within the community as well as a broader community. So a little bit of background here, we talk about a lot of that. And, according to the United Nations, there are approximately 43 million people who are right now as refugees. And Burma has more than 400,000 refugees. Just want to note here that this is only those who are registered with the United Nations. There are perhaps more than 2 or 3 million Burmese refugees around the world, specifically, especially in Southeast Asia. So that's a pretty big number. And to the perspective, according to the Immigration Policy Institute, there are approximately 43 million migrants in the United States right now by 2014. And that is somewhere 30% of total population of the United States. And so Burmese is part of that. Let's try to look into that way. So where they come from, why they are here. Burma is in Southeast Asia. It occupies the mainland of Southeast Asia and borders to China and India. So this also makes very important strategically and geographically to the United States as well. Let me also give a little bit of in terms of ethnic diversity and religious diversity. Burma is a multi-ethnic state, extremely diverse. We have 8 major ethnic groups and more than 135 subgroups. And there are 52 million somewhere, and somewhere 67% of total population is Burman, who is known as the majority of the total population of major ethnic group, dominating ethnic group. And the rest are considered to be the ethnic minorities. And religious, Buddhist is dominated again. We also have Muslim, Christians, and animists. So this kind of gives us a little bit of the background, the language, what's happening in Burma. The white area is settled or occupied by the majority Burman, largely Buddhist, and the frontier areas or borders to international borders are ethnic minorities or religious minorities. So Burma has faced more than half century systematic deprivation of rights and ethnic conflicts that basically causing the influx of exodus of refugees from this country. And Burma gave independence from British in 1948. And 1948 to 62, it was a democratic government. But it's very important to know that even at that time, there was already religious minorities, ethnic minorities persecution taking place. And in 62 to 88, there was another repressive regime that ran the country. In 1990 to 2010, another type of regime, still all authoritarian. And 2010 we held general elections, and 2015 just last year will be another general elections. And now, although we are hoping, we think that we can be optimistically positive about change in Burma, but the constitution is designed in a way that the military still hold the power. So this is some of, just to give you some of those regimes, the leaders who have run in Burma for several decades. And one of the factors or the methods that they use to persecute ethnic minorities, forced labor, arbitrary arrest, child soldiers, and basically they are above the law. They can do anything they want to ethnic minorities. So I think I will not talk about this anymore. Our Professor Bernadette discussed about refugees definitions here. The reason I just want to point out is the refugees are not illegal migrants. Just want to point that this is under the United Nations 1951 Convention, and also specifically to the U.S. it is under the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program, which is somewhat 35 years old. And Burmese fled their country because of the systematic right to privacy persecution, so they first of all go to second countries. In the case of Burma, basically they go to Thailand, India, and Malaysia. And India is, as we all know, one of the most largest democracies, and they want to welcome refugees. But the challenge is, we'll talk later a little bit about it, they don't necessarily encourage third country resettlement. The reason is partly because of political, and also because they want to show to the world that they can protect refugees. But realistically, that's not happening, unfortunately. And in Thailand, there are refugee camps, some of you probably already know, and they also give some protection in UNHCR. Malaysia also has a big number, and Malaysia is a little bit different of the country's policies. They kind of encourage resettlement or voluntary repatriation. Either you go back home or you go to third country. We don't necessarily love you here in our country. That's basically the difference between Malaysia and India. And with that now, somewhere actually I think closer to 200,000, but this number is since only 2000, and we have Burmese refugees here in the United States, and more than 22,000 in Indiana, and closer to 16,000 right now in Indianapolis. And very interestingly, 37%, somewhere 40 to 30. We have done this research, by the way, in the last 5 years, and somewhere 40 to 45% consistently has been the secondary migrants, those who move from different states and cities across the United States to Indianapolis. And people ask why Indianapolis. It is Midwest. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. So I think that's a little bit of to give the background information, the reason, the process in which they are coming to the United States. What is the solution, sustainable solutions? Do we have the solutions for this population? First of all, those who are in the second country, we still have somewhere, I think, 1.7 million migrants, Burmese migrants in Malaysia, and closer to 1 million in Singapore. And Malaysia has somewhere, I think, 600,000, 700,000. but someone 250 claim they claim themselves to be refugees. Those who need protection of United Nations. So first of all, the need. What is the solution? How we are going to be able to maintain in terms of security and economy, social, and education. First recommendation is they need protection. And the second country, although in Malaysia particularly, even if you recognize as refugees, Malaysia is a signatory to 1951 Convention. Therefore, they can still arrest them, jail them, deport them. They can treat just like any other illegal migrants. So that has been a huge issue. But there are some other international treaties and international norms. For example, a Universal Human Rights Declaration that we still need to respect human being as a human, and they still are entitled to as a human rights. So the United States, for example, international community has been asking Malaysia to respect that right, even if you are not signatory to 51 Convention. And more often, long-term and durable solutions. The UNHCR, United Nations, usually do three things to solve a problem or to reach solutions. One is voluntary repatriation. This is simply now the refugees think that they are able to go back home and live life as usual or normal. And to be able to help them, there has to be three conditions. One is there has to be legal arrangement that guarantees the rights of refugees. If they return, then they are going to be protected. And secondly, there will need to be social economic assistance, which is very much like when we settle in our countries, we provide basic assistance to stage of resettlement. And thirdly, and most importantly, it has to be voluntary. The refugees will need to say or agree that now they can return, and they are willing to return. And those who are in countries like Australia or in some of the Europe countries and specifically in the United States, there are a lot of, we just discussed about economic benefits and some other benefits, diversity. I just want to, among many, I want to anchor three things. One is a policy environment that embraces diversity and appreciate the fact that it's actually contributing to the community and society on a large scale. For instance, India, I was just mentioning, why Midwest and Indianapolis, why they are coming refugees now again? If we look at East Coast and West Coast, they have welcomed strangers for decades, perhaps centuries. And they have gone out education, economy, much, much better than the Midwest in general. So I think we are seeing in India, not only just Indian leadership, but also Midwest leadership, as a matter of policy that welcoming them and working together is a win-win. And actually that contributes to, in many ways, an education classroom setting or in workforce anyway, diversity increases the performance of the group, of the organization. So they definitely see that, that's which we are grateful. Let me also say we're thankful for that. And the second is, I think, investing in people and education. I think I will not go farther on that. But let me also point out that PRM State Department or our Office of Refugee Resettlement under the Department of Health and Human Services, they are starting to change or shift the conversation of the policy, how we are going to receive and resettle refugees. Instead of just providing fish to eat, why don't we work with them and teach them how to fish? So I think they are reforming in the course of the past several years, and now it's changing, which is a great sign, especially under the President Obama's administration. And in economic terms, let's look at a little bit about some of the key factors. Now, communities across the United States are seeing it that with the refugees or migrants, they are better. And they are contributing to be competitive and vibrant community. And this is in Indiana, for example. Some of this is more of immigrants' contributions. In 2014, migrants or businesses generated more than 200 million. And 17% of Fortune 500 owners are migrant individuals. And also the last point is very important. 22% immigrants are likely to be willing to work than native or mainstream American. And also in education factors. They are not, of course, I think, following up in terms of the high school diploma earning rate. It might actually, because of a lot of them come here old enough not to be able to restart their schools. Therefore, a lot of percentage are not keeping up or following when they're mainstream. The second group actually, high school is quite good. For example, 66%, 39%. And now in a bachelor or undergrad level, we are catching in India. It's the same percentage. And actually, graduate level, they are surpassing. So if you kind of try to see from the perspective of the long-term sustainability of the community, a state as the US, I think this is very important fact. So for group 3, these groups, I think this is basically those who still in their own country. For example, Burmese, ethnic groups, religious groups. In here, I think it will be a little bit more overstretched, but the articulation, the philosophy is that it has to be addressed comprehensively. We just cannot take the refugees and solve the problem only those who already left their own country. We will need to also work together with international communities to address the root causes, which can be political reform, development, sustainable development, economic livelihood, that will eventually be able to contribute to the sustainability of refugees or migrants. So how do we do that? There are basically two systems of change. One is systemic change that has to come through political reforms that will involve constitutional reforms, institution buildings, and enforcing that rules and institutions through rule of law. And the second type of change is societal change. For example, in Burma, the education level is very low that we heard about democracy only. We don't know how to practice. We don't know how to put that into life and system. So I think this is more sustainable in a sense that nobody can take away your education from you. And those individuals from society and that become a society, a democratic society. And but there are several others. I think I'm kind of running out of time. So, China and India, we usually talk about this as well. That does not mean that we don't like the democracy. But China, if you look into the societal level, China is better than India. In a sense that China don't usually have communal violence, and the economic status is better. Society is perhaps as a society better, but in the system, of course, India there's democracy. They have freedom of expressions. Although they should be going parallelly, the point here is it has to do address comprehensively and also parallel. So BSCI, a little bit to introduce also. That's really part of the whole thinking, how we are part of contributing to this sustainability. And then everything we do is education and for long-term development and sustainable integrations. So I think I will end.
I'm just going to ask if you guys ask a question, please speak as loud as you can. For Malika, who's in Tajikistan, her microphone is right here. So if you can, speak as loudly as you can, and I'll try to repeat as well.
Please.
So I wonder if you guys can speak to psychosocial health in migrant populations. I'm especially thinking about the current crises that are going on, people migrating from war zones. What are the implications of psychosocial health? Is that something that's being taken care of in the populations where their psychosocial health is being cared for and considered? And then those implications on a possible return to country or to a workforce, what are they, and what do you think about the loss of human capital when it comes to people who are suffering with any kind of mental illness or trauma who are not receiving care?
So psychosocial.
Questions about psychosocial issues in
No, that's good. Yeah, so the part of the issue when we emphasize and prioritize economic productivity of refugees over refugees as people is that aspects like that are not brought into that dialogue. So it was interesting you used the word productive citizenship. That's actually a theory I'm developing at the moment about what it means to be a productive citizen and how refugees use that terminology and how that's applied to them. Because the whole idea of asylum in Uganda is based on the premise that refugees can and want to work. And for many that's true, but for some that's not possible because of issues like the fact that they just saw their husband get murdered in front of them, that they have been dealing with the most horrific sexual violence you could ever imagine, and they're dealing with that both mentally and physically. These have physical impacts on people. So that sort of, that complicates the productivity model of the refugee. And this is something I'm writing on at the moment because we don't talk in academia about refugees as productive people. Maybe they do in political science, in anthropology they don't. It becomes a humanitarian issue. But the policies of forced migration aren't about humanitarianism, they are about political economy. So, I mean, and then you have the whole issue about psychosocial as a Western model of thinking about health. So, I mean, the people I worked with would describe how they lost their mind. They couldn't even, some of them couldn't describe how they got to Uganda. They didn't know what had happened to them. They'd had, you know, and I could psychologize that and say that they had had like a mental blackout or something like that, but that's not how they themselves see it. So working out, you know, how to manage care in these contexts is just extremely complicated. And for the people I worked with, it was certainly overlooked. And in Australia, the refugees I worked with all had access to free counselling, specifically around torture and trauma. So every state in Australia has a torture and trauma counselling service, which is free to refugees. But again, it was a matter of that didn't really work with their understanding. So what we often saw was people having breakdowns, which then created a whole other bunch of issues, and then the court would force them to go into counselling. So, I mean, there's two issues here in the fact that how do we understand mental health, or how do they understand mental health, and then how is that accommodated? So it's two separate things. My general answer to that is that it's not being brought into the dialogue of how we understand refugees as people. But that's just what I think about.
Malika, did you have anything to add? Or? Oh, sorry, we can't hear you now.
I think her mic is muted.
I think your mic is muted, yes.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, good.
So the question was on psychosocial support to refugees.
Yes.
Yes, I guess I will pass on that because it's not really my area of expertise. And although I worked with Afghan migrant workers in Tajikistan, psychosocial support wasn't something that was major, like major activity amongst the providers of support to refugees here, to Afghan refugees in Tajikistan. So
Okay,
I don't really have much to add.
Thank you.
Well, I think just want to echo what here the previous discussors said. I think it's definitely a challenge, and a lot of them, especially when they come from traumatized experience or war or complaints, and also sometimes exacerbated by the environment in which they are playing. So I think they need extra care, which also means that probably there has to be people, those who were trained culturally as well as technically, to be able to effectively address that issue. And the good thing is this issue has been recognized by the federal government as well. And they have increased the funding quite significantly as well in the past several years. It's not that there are a lot many it's happening with a mental health issue, but even just one person takes a lot of efforts and resources to be taken care of. So I think that's definitely the issue, but also a challenge. But I think there is also resources put together to be more effectively addressing.
Right.
Yeah, I can tell you what they're doing in Germany for this, because frankly the Germans aren't organized. There's a major center in Darmstadt for trauma care, and what Germans, I was just there last fall, and the Germans figure that 15 to 20% of the refugees have been traumatized to a significant degree. I would add that German bureaucracy is traumatizing. That was not.
I used to live there. I understand.
Okay. They don't consider that one of the things. But the Darmstadt Center is a major center. And there's research to show that trauma can be passed on genetically also, but that's another thing. But the Germans also have 15 major centers throughout Germany where migrants can get major trauma care. So I think they're taking it very, very seriously. And it was especially, where's my compatriot on the panel from Iraq? Especially the women who've been sexually abused. And because in Germany you have to pass language tests before you can do pretty much anything, nobody can focus on German grammar while they're traumatized. And you just can't focus on anything with the trauma. So they're seeing this as basic to anything. And I think that's why the Germans are taking it so seriously.
Yeah.
Writing off of what you just mentioned and discussing the concept of viewing refugees as whole people and talking about the difficulties that they face in a new setting or a new context, I was wondering about incorporating the language test that you were speaking on. What kind of linguistic or educational support are you finding in each of your investigative contexts?
I really want to talk about this, actually, especially going off the US example. So I'm always shocked. I do a lot of work around resettlement here as well, and I work with people who work in resettlement. And I'm always shocked by the way that they write off the first generation of refugees here. They're like, oh, well, the parents aren't going to get college education, but we know that, but we'll work on the kids. And I'm like, well, okay, so where I come from in Australia, I'm trying to write on this at the moment. We have an education model. So it sounds really nice, I understand that, but it's actually kind of an integration stimulus model. It's like if you don't learn English and, so there's issues with that. the US has a work productivity model. So refugees who are resettled in this country have supposedly 90 days to become self-sufficient. So the parallel between the self-reliance strategy in Uganda and the self-sufficiency model in the US are quite nice as a parallel. But in Australia, we don't have that. So in Australia, refugees, and actually all migrants in Australia, have access to 500 hours of free English tuition. Then they get free sort of TAFE education, which means that they can go and do more English. They can go and do certificates in aged care, hospitality work, blah, blah, blah. Community service work, which then puts them into jobs. But actually, most of the refugees I worked with as a resettlement officer, particularly the men, women to a lesser extent, but definitely the men, were actually going to university. So I did my undergraduate degree sitting beside refugees. And here, that's just kind of almost unimaginable. And I'm not talking like, refugees who came here when they were 11, I'm talking about refugee men who are like 50 years old. So there are ways of, there is an otherwise, and the panel before was talking about this otherwise, and I think that's a really interesting concept because we can't think outside of what is happening. Maybe not in these political circumstances, but I know people who have become educated and gotten university degrees. Of course, they can't get jobs because Australia is racist, but that's a different issue, right? So, so this education question is really powerful because the refugees I worked with saw education as the reason they wanted resettlement. I want to get an education, or an education for my children. So I think it's something that should be pushed more to the fore. And in terms of, so I also work at an education research center, but in terms of people in asylum, that's often, because refugees in asylum are considered to be temporary. Education is not something that is prioritized, particularly beyond the primary level. So, primary education is considered to be something every person in the world should have access to. But then when it comes to secondary education, tertiary education, this is not seen as a right for a lot of refugees. So, I've read case studies about camps in the Thai-Burma border, so in Thailand, where Burmese people, ethnic minorities, are actually claiming refugee status in Thailand so that they can send their children to the schools and the camps there. So there's a whole lot of interesting stuff around education that could definitely, that needs to be looked at, it needs to be brought to the fore. I'm actually doing a special issue on refugees in higher education soon with a colleague. So it's an underdeveloped discourse, but something that needs to be brought to the fore.
Thank you.
Just to elaborate on that, the federal government refugee resettlement agencies like to say linguistically cultural delivery services. And when we deliver services, that's important. But we need to go beyond that, not just service. How they are going to be able to integrate and succeed in the education economy in the long run. So for example, in local level in Indiana, Perry Township School District has 2,500 Burmese refugee kids. It's a huge challenge. Some of them don't even speak English. So how you are going to deal with these kids that they are catching up with the high school and they're actually ready for college? So we have to work it together with stakeholders to create a model through which they can be achieving their potential and going through that. So we have been very successful. So we like to say actually, Indianapolis probably might be served as a national model for many ways. In cultural integration, advocacy, and a little bit of a more broader advocacy. But refugees we see in the street, the way they shop, the way they go and walk, they eat, people very easy to tap to where are these people coming from? Who are they? But when we engage actually, talk each other, what we can do together for common interest, people are usually good people. And refugees are usually, as we have seen facts out of research, that they're productive. They are contributing in many ways. So I think I can say that Indianapolis is doing great as community as a whole, and the community from the government and justice level, city and non-profit education institutions, community, they are very supportive. And I think the city as a whole is now moving forward to that direction.
Malika, do you have anything to say?
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. So the knowledge of Russian is actually fairly interesting in the context of the migration, Central Asian migration to Russia. And here, what is interesting is that older generation of migrant workers who are in their 40s and 50s and working in Russia, they were socialized during the Soviet Union, so they know Russian. For most of them, Russian was their first or second language. And however, the younger generation who are in their 20s and even 30s who go to Russia, they have more problems with Russian and with operating in Russian in the Russian Federation because they were mostly socialized with Tajik language or Uzbek language schools in Tajikistan. The education system worked here changed quite drastically, and so also reduction of the Russian language teaching in schools here. As a result, we have younger generation who go from villages to Russia without any knowledge of Russian, which actually stirred lots of frustrations in Russia, both among public and also bureaucrats who work with migrant workers. And to address this issue, the Russian government designed a number of programs on integration. And the knowledge of Russian and the teaching of Russian to migrant workers is one of the aspects of those integration programs. There are schools, evening schools and evening classes that are available to migrant workers. However, they also don't take into account the nature of work while in Russia, because most of the migrant workers are afraid to leave the work premises because of the police harassment and the threat of being detained while working from point A to point B. So there is no really much freedom of movement for many migrant workers while in Russia. Some of them have unregulated status, which also puts them at the risk of being detained and kept in the detention centers. As a result, these classes are most of the time quite empty, and there is no much demand among migrant workers for Russian language lessons. At the same time, during my fieldwork, when I was interviewing migrant workers and doing participant observation in Russia, it was quite obvious that migrant workers, while on work, pick up Russian very not easily, but they spent a year and a half, and in the end, they do speak quite decent Russian. So they socialize into the language while at work, working with Russian colleagues as well, and with Russian management. And most of them use apps and some textbooks which they purchase and learn themselves. There are, of course, cases of younger generational workers who come with the network and join the network of their relatives who act as a buffer and protector for them. And they just pick up the Russian just enough in order to implement their professional duties. For example, if you sell in the store, you will very quickly pick up a certain terminology that allows you to sell shoes or whatever is being sold quite efficiently, and yet he or she will be very uncomfortable in Russian when it comes to other topics or other things. But while the integration programs do provide Russian language training for workers, they are not necessarily in demand among workers themselves.
Thank you.
I have a question about migrant organizations. In my research, those were crucial for the migrants actually coping. And I noticed your organization, the Burmese American Community Institute, and I've seen that those can make a huge difference. Did you find these in Uganda? Did the people in Kampala organize? What I found were hometown Landesmannschaften. We get these in America, hometown organizations. Do they exist?
I think there are a few in a formal capacity, but primarily for the refugees I worked with in Uganda, it was church groups. So church groups.
Church groups.
Yeah, were the most significant aspect to their protection, more than anything else. So like people I worked with, church groups that had like a dominant ethnic group that were running them, but sometimes also Ugandan churches. So I mean, a lot of the time when they would first get to say Kampala, they would end up living in a church because the church would open itself up to these particular groups. So I wouldn't necessarily say that there was an ethnic community like in a formal capacity that was crucial, but more of a religious group. In Australia, we have a lot of ethnic community groups who are crucial to resettlement. It's not the same as in the US where there's a lot of funding for these ethnic community groups. It's not, most of we generally have like one NGO who does most of the resettlement work, but the refugees don't trust them. But then there's a lot of competitiveness around ethnic groups and who gets elected, so it's very political amongst refugees themselves about these groups and accessing support through them. So it's very complicated, but yeah, generally like the government or the formal services are not where people are getting their sense of support from at all.
No, it's from each other. Is this also true from the Tajik groups in Russia?
Malika, did you hear the question?
No.
Oh, your microphone's popping in, I think.
No, I haven't. Could you please repeat the question?
Yeah. When these Tajik migrants go to Russia, do they have groups that support each other there from hometowns in Tajikistan?
Yeah. Okay, I see. Migrant workers, there are diaspora groups which act in every city or region where migrant workers concentrate, which act as representatives of migrant workers. So when the Russian government wants to organize something with migrant workers, or they need to basically pass the message to workers on changes of the laws or any other event, they usually act via diaspora groups. And diaspora groups are mostly comprised of migrant or former migrant workers who received Russian citizenship and who live for a certain period in Russia, and they act as representatives. There are also human rights groups operating in Moscow and St. Petersburg primarily because migrant workers are concentrated in these two major cities, which are also operated by diaspora representatives. And unfortunately, there are also groups comprised of former citizens or current citizens of Tajikistan that are also engaged in trafficking of migrant workers and labor exploitation. So these groups are very diverse, and their role in bringing people and or in protecting their rights or basically selling migrant workers for labor exploitation is very diverse. So there is no really clear cut. And here, when international organizations or the government is trying to work with diaspora groups as representatives of migrant workers, there is also always this problem is where you draw the line between traffickers and groups that are promoting interests and rights of migrant workers.
This isn't something that the Russian government can use. This is how migrant groups develop their own strength by their own organizations. This isn't something that they want the Russian government to use at all. This is their own network, that they protect their own people. I would not say it's at all, it would be the antithesis of something that the Russian government could use.
So the diaspora groups, I think they fulfill this dual role. Many of them do operate for their compatriots, and mostly organized around regional ties as well. So there is no diaspora diaspora group for Tajikistani citizens. There is diaspora group, for example, in the city of Vladimir, that is mostly upgrades for Tajikistanis from a particular region. And diaspora groups, they implement this dual role very often. They do network and cooperate with the Russian government, and they also provide services for migrant workers. And most of the time, the major service that diaspora groups provide for migrant workers is unfortunately, the relocation of the Carver 2000. This is how basically the dead bodies of migrant workers is named here, Carver 2000, Gruz 200. I'm not sure why, but diaspora groups are very much involved exactly in provision of services when migrant workers die, either from violence or more often from unsafe condition, working condition in Russia.
I saw that there's a few more hands up for questions. However, we are out of time, so maybe you could just speak to the panelists individually. Please join me in thanking the panelists.